To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he's doing is good, or else that it's a well-considered act in conformity with natural law. So wrote Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, his magisterial description of Soviet communism's terrors and tortures and prisons. Solzhenitsyn was taking issue with the Shakespearean notion of evildoers, who know themselves for the bad guys they are. Richard III, for instance, who declared he was determined to prove a villain, or Aaron the Moor, who wanted to have his soul black like his face. Solzhenitsyn notes that Shakespeare's self-aware villains are amateurs at the art of murder. They stopped short at a dozen corpses, he said, because they had no ideology. Ideology, he writes, that is what gives evildoing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes. I believe, even by his own logic, Solzhenitsyn is only half right, or at least only states half the case, and he sells my old friend Shakespeare short. He's right about this. An ideology, a bad ideology, is the vehicle by which the fine idea of corruption can spread over an entire society like a fog. In the impenetrable murk of a bad ideology, the corruption becomes all but invisible until even the best and the brightest can engage in the most appalling behavior completely unawares. Or return to the Soviets and their gulags. If they were fully convinced that the Communist Party was the source of all goodness, why were they so desperate to crush any disagreement? Why did they see dissent everywhere, even when there was none? They imprisoned, tortured, and executed people not just for the slightest aberration from communist ideology, but for the possibility that aberration might one day occur. Do men who are certain of their moral position behave that way, or is it only those whose sense of virtue depends on a shared delusion so fragile that even the possibility of clarity will shatter it? Consider a vote in the American Senate just last February, a bill that would have strengthened the penalties for denying care to babies born alive after an attempted abortion was scuttled by 44 senators who support abortion. Less than a quarter century after such supporters told us abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, their activists are encouraging women to shout their abortions with pride, and their lawmakers cast votes that deny protections to fully born babies. If a baby fully born is not a human being with a right to life, who the hell is? But of course, if you have taken a step down the road to evil, you're forced to run farther and farther down that road, lest you stop and turn and see yourself as you are. Whether they act with no inducement to evil, but evil itself, or justify their acts with ideology, those who do wrong feel guilty because they are guilty and they act that way. They see catastrophe looming everywhere, they stifle dissent, they escape from smaller sins into greater and greater atrocities. They've distorted the moral universe and their own souls. They are living in a world gone mad. Indeed, before these times, there were days when people were set on by police dogs and lynch mobs for the crime of having brown skin. There were holocausts and slavery and war. There always are. The fog of insanity thins and gathers, hangs offshore, and comes rolling in. But there is always moral madness somewhere, and there is always someone who will call it justice. Still, as the great philosopher Gandalf the Wizard told Frodo, we have to decide what to do with the time that is given us. We have to determine how to behave when our era, when our corner of the world goes insane. I look around at the United States and I see a nation full of wonders. Longer life in better health than ever before, running water everywhere, plentiful and inexpensive food, all information, literature, and art available at the touch of a pocket-sized phone. Most of the crises we face are crises of the imagination. If when reading the news you edit out all the stories about the disasters some gloomy experts think might happen, you'll be amazed at just how terrific things are here. To paraphrase the immortal lyrics of Johnny Mercer in the only lousy song he ever wrote, for Americans, everything truly is tickety-boo. I attribute this astounding liberation from humankind's long history of poverty, plague, and violence to three developments: science, capitalism, and liberalism, by which last I mean the commitment to self-government and individual human rights. It's my personal theory that these three innovations spring from one idea, the idea that all creation is made to work in freedom without intrusive overseers. That's the thought that links Isaac Newton to Adam Smith to the American founding fathers. Science, capitalism, and liberalism all assume that the proper machinery is in place and does not need to be micromanaged. God does not need to tinker with the stars. He made them to do the starry stuff they do. Governments don't need to control the economy. If we trade with each other under a few reasonable rules of fairness, our ambition and creativity will cause everyone to rise and thrive. And individuals don't require monarchs to dictate their actions, thoughts, and speech. We've been given the moral wherewithal to run our own homes, communities, and countries ourselves. In this three-in-one trinity of ideas, we have become uniquely blessed. But in defense of those blessings, it's worthwhile to note the patches of fog of bad ideology that seem to be gathering in the intellectual centers where the culture of the future is often made. To remind you, the three symptoms I look for are inordinate fear of catastrophe, the silencing of dissent, and the steady progress from moral error to atrocity. I find these symptoms beginning to appear to various degrees of severity in elite thinking about the economy, race, and sex. In the realm of the economy, capitalism and improved property rights have cut extreme poverty in half worldwide over the last 30 years, and in America, the poor now live at the level of the middle class of the 1980s. Yet a presidential candidate who praised the mass-murdering communists of Cuba and unapologetically honeymooned in the slave state of the Soviet Union preaches socialism to a nodding press and cheering crowds of young people. In the matter of race relations, surely there is one and only one correct approach: to love your neighbor who is made in God's image and to judge each person by the content of his character rather than the color of his skin. Yet after my father's generation fought to end the wickedness of segregation and Jim Crow, I see my children's generation attending universities with segregated dorms, where they are taught the viciously racist philosophy of intersectionality, as if it were the cure to bigotry rather than a new strain of the old disease. As for human sexuality, it's always a disordered business where the most urgent desires of our material bodies and the deepest longings of our fallen souls conjoin. But that there is such a thing as human sexuality, that it is centered on the differences between the two sexes, male and female, that those differences are written into our very selves and are among the chief joys and consolations of experience, and indeed are the very archetype and inspiration of all earthly love and creation. These are human universals known from the jungle up and essential to the formation of every single society that has ever existed on earth. The idea that these yin-yang bedrock facts of life are merely cultural constructs and can therefore be completely erased by wishing very hard and dressing in one another's clothing is simple lunacy. In each of these cases, I see exaggerated fear of catastrophe in the form of climate panic, overblown anxiety about fascism and white supremacism, and the anguished, hysterical cowering from debate in so-called safe spaces. I see the silencing of dissent, where voices of fact and logic, science and experience are punished in the workplace, edited out of search engines, deplatformed from social media, and barred from campus or met with heckling and violence. And I see the progress from error toward atrocity, from government interference and cronyism in the economy to the certain economic ruin of socialism, from supposedly corrective racial preferences to resurrected segregation and the bigotry of intersectionality, and from the disparagement of femininity and motherhood to infanticide and the sexual butchery of children in the name of gender reassignment. Like the good ideas that have brought us so far, these bad ideas, to my mind, are all one idea. It is the idea that man is matter and that therefore the moral world can only be a fictional creation of his brain, which can be changed by changing the stories he's told and is allowed to tell. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, says St. Paul, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. We are in a war of ideas in which we must defend the idea of the human soul and the moral world in which it has its being and its rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We need to mount this defense with logic, with science, with patience, with humor, and with courage. We need to do it, yes, even if they ban us from Twitter and Facebook. We need to do it even when they riot on campus at our speeches. We need to do it even if our professor marks us down and our boss sends us to HR and our sponsor drops our show. And God prevent it should ever come to this, but if at last the truth itself is outlawed, then outlaws we must become. Outlaws like Socrates and Jesus and the believers who faced the Roman lions and the patriots who faced the British guns. I don't mean to be melodramatic, but we have to at least embrace the principle that telling the truth about the human condition is worth great sacrifice, so we'll be ready to face the lesser sacrifices that even here, even now, the truth sometimes demands. We have to be ready to make those sacrifices for truth because the wages of lies are corruption, slavery, and death. This country has been so free, so safe, so powerful, so long, that it's easy to forget how quickly freedom can be lost in the fog of bad ideas. Wandering in that fog, the world goes mad. And in a world gone mad, we cannot be silent.